What do you think is faster? A blue hedgehog who can canonically run around at the speed of sound, or an average mid-sized sedan? We're playing Sonic racing games. When Nintendo created Super Mario Kart, the racing genre was flipped on its head. Racing games before were largely focused on being driving simulators or taking place in real-world scenarios. But after Mario Kart, that took more of a backseat to the wacky item shenanigans and unrealistic racetracks. And other game devs took notice. Any IP with a shred of popularity was being plopped into a go-kart. Game franchises like Crash Bandicoot and Final Fantasy, and random things like South Park. So it's no surprise that Sonic the Hedgehog, a character literally made to compete directly with Mario, found his way into some racing games. Now, many of you are probably already thinking of one particular Sonic racing game, but you might be surprised to know that game wasn't Sonic's first. Sega's first jump into the kart racing genre was with Sonic Drift, released for the Sega Game Gear in 1994, exclusively in Japan. But in the years since, it's been re-released in various collections, like Sonic Origins Plus. You can definitely see where they were inspired by Super Mario Kart, and it's an interesting choice to put it on a handheld with 18 pixels of screen size, but hey, I respect it. Actually, I lied, I don't respect it at all. The screen on the Game Gear is already so tiny. There's just barely any room for an engaging amount of content. And on top of that, they split the 18 pixel screen in half to display a map, which is just insane. You barely have any screen for actual racing. There are only 4 racers: Sonic, Tails, Eggman, and Amy. And there are 18 tracks, which is a deceptively high number. Really, there are 6 track themes, and 3 different layouts for each, and when the layouts are just this, it's really not all that impressive. There are also a limited number of items, but for being on the Game Gear, that doesn't bother me all that much. There are springs that let you jump in the air, red monitors for boost, and blue monitors for invincibility. Along with that, you can pick up rings, and collecting 2 lets you spend them on a character's special ability. I just did not really care for this game. The way that they tried to simulate moving down the track by alternating the colors of these lines just hurts my eyes so bad. They really flopped on the handling as well, as many of these old kart racers did. Turns are so tight that you have to drift on them, but you can spin out after like half a second of drifting. So your options are spin out on the track, or drive in the grass and hit a road sign. Try again. I think I'm okay. They made a sequel. Sonic Drift 2 was once again released for the Game Gear, but this time left Japan and saw a worldwide release. Generally, the game plays the same as Drift 1, but they did make some small adjustments. The movement was kind of improved. I do feel like I have better control of my character a little bit, but overall it still kinda sucks. They also changed the colors on the tracks to simulate the moving road, which makes it so much easier on the eyes. Except for on this track, which is as bad as ever. I obviously wasn't playing this on a real Game Gear, so it's possible that the alternating colors weren't that big a deal on the original screen, but on the emulated versions they made for modern collections, it was such an eyesore. The tracks also have a little more charm to them. There are elements in the environment that just add that little bit extra. The tracks are also a bit more elaborate this time around. I guess they got a little overconfident because they touched up the controls, but sadly, it wasn't enough because you can still lose your handling so easily. Also, f*** the rainy Savannah track. I have no idea why they included this lightning that flashbangs you every few seconds, which is horrible for a game where you can only see 18 pixels in the first place. This time around, they added these weird slope things at certain stretches, and I have no idea what they're supposed to be. When I first saw this show up, I actually thought my game was glitching. It just kinda looks wrong. Basically, Sonic Drift 2 is the same as Sonic Drift 1. In modern terms, it feels more like a patch update than it does a sequel. But I do get to play as my favorite character, Knuckles. After 2 so-so games on an incredibly clunky handheld, Sega asked themselves what everyone else was asking. Why is Sonic in a car? Sonic R was Sega's first ever home console Sonic racing game, released for the Sega Saturn. Traveler's Tales was commissioned to develop the game, retooling an engine for a Formula 1 game that they had previously been working on. Rather than making strictly a racing game, Traveler's Tales wanted to integrate Sonic's core series of platformers into the racing genre, which resulted in the unique setup seen here. Most characters just straight up run, but then you got damn cheaters like Robotnik and Amy who get to use vehicles for some reason. Every course has alternate paths and secret areas to find, and this is all done by essentially giving the racer freedom to go anywhere. Other kart racers keep you strictly on the path that the developers have given you, and you get plopped on the track if you try to leave. With Sonic R, you can go anywhere, even ignoring the track altogether. And it was certainly an interesting premise. Now prior to this video, I had never played Sonic R before, but the game is the butt of so many jokes and routinely shows up on worst game compilations, so all of this was already in the back of my mind before I booted the game up. And let me just say, the internet wasn't wrong this time. These are some of the slipperiest controls I have ever encountered. It's like every stage has ice physics, but nope, that's just how the game plays. A lot of times in these games there are very hard turns where you need to hit a really good line to not bonk the sides. But there are truly some turns in this game that I could never successfully make it through. It's like Sonic has butter on his feet. An aspect of the game I actually don't mind is the track design with the alternate paths, at least in concept. It's sort of like that Yoshi's Valley track in Mario Kart 64, with a ton of different paths that you can take. In execution though, I think there's definite room for improvement. Like, it's cool you can take alternate routes, but there just ends up being an objectively fastest route that once you figure it out, you just end up taking it every time. But one downside of making the whole map traversable is that all the cool fancy stuff is kinda pointless. Like, check out this loop-de-loop. Whee! Yeah, taking it is completely pointless. In fact, the CPU racers literally just run around it too. It's actually hilarious. They know that's a waste of time. And one of the worst crimes is that there are only 5 tracks. That is shockingly low. But I guess there is a plus side. It means less of this atrocious game to play. I mean, it's a neat idea for a racing game, since being fast is Sonic's whole thing. It just didn't execute all that well. Apparently, Traveler's Tales only had 9 months of development for this, so frankly, I have to give props to them for actually managing to create a functional game in that amount of time. Okay, maybe they just get one prop. But SEGA doesn't exclusively create mediocrity for their consoles. No. They're down for anything that can play games. Over in Japan, SEGA had a pretty consistent flow of games released for cell phones under the service called Sonic Cafe. There were ports of some of their pre-existing games, and there were also basic phone games with a Sonic theme, like billiards or card games. But they also created some more original stuff, like Sonic Racing Kart, originally released in 2002. Calling this a racing game is pretty generous. It's a glorified time trial mode where you can race through a handful of courses and try to loop the track as fast as you can. If you were playing the service while it was still live, you could download other players' races and try to beat their time. So I guess in that sense it is a racing game. Sonic Cafe and its successor, Puyo Puyo Sega, have both since been discontinued, and you can't play this game in any official capacity. In fact, I couldn't even track down the Japanese version of the game. The one I'm playing was actually a graphically updated and localized version released in Brazil. And speaking of games you can't find, Racing Kart got a sequel, Sonic Kart 3DX. Now this is true and honest lost media. This game was also released on both of SEGA's mobile services, but an archive version of this game has never been posted online. For a while, footage wasn't even available, until December 2020, when a pretty lengthy YouTube video was posted showing off gameplay for the game. As the name suggests, it was a 3D sequel to Racing Kart and had a similar time trial mode. However, you could also race others using the network, though naturally the uploader wasn't able to recreate this. Honestly, it looks fine, but I think the novelty of it being lost media makes it seem way more interesting than it actually is, and if this game was readily available, I don't think very many people would choose to play it. So we've had Sonic in a cart, we had Sonic running on his feet, and we had Sonic stuck inside a cell phone nearly lost from recorded history. What else could SEGA try? Sonic Riders was SEGA's answer to fans wanting another Sonic racing game. And you know what? Fair enough. It had been almost a decade since Sonic R, I think it's been enough time to give it another try. They set out with the goal of making a racing game better than any previous Sonic game. But they didn't want to create your standard racing game. They wanted to have tricks and more dynamic movement, which they felt couldn't be done in a car. So they landed on a hoverboard, combining the versatility of a snowboard or surfboard while being able to work on any terrain, which is a great idea. I've always had a soft spot for boarding games, like Tony Hawk or SSX, but putting it in a Sonic context makes it more over the top. Sonic Riders introduced 3 new characters as well: Jet the Hawk, Wave the Swallow, and Storm the Albatross, collectively known as the Babylon Rogues. In the story mode, Eggman holds a racing tournament, and then a few story beats go by, and it turns out you're reviving an ancient civilization. It's so funny what SEGA does with Sonic sometimes. Like, yeah, here's the silly little hedgehog guy in a racing game. By the way, Satan's here, and if you don't skateboard, he'll send you to the 9th circle of hell. Unfortunately though, I really tried to like this one, but the controls and whole air system just never clicked for me. You've got an air meter on the side, and you have to keep this meter filled to maintain your speed by either picking up air from item boxes or performing tricks. If you hit empty, you just have to run until you can refill at a pit stop. Now I get they wanted a layer of strategy, but I kinda just hate it. Like, you lose air by drifting, which is one of the most basic mechanics of a racing game, but it's like they're actively discouraging you from drifting. It also felt like a struggle to get things like the charge jump or grinding to work, but I don't know, maybe that is just a skill issue. Every track has alternate paths that are exclusive to certain character archetypes: speed, flight, and power, inspired by the same system found in Sonic Heroes. Speed lets you grind on rails, flight lets you take accelerators through the air bypassing part of the track, and power lets you smash through obstacles that other characters can't clear. Early on, these are essentially locked to particular characters, but eventually you can unlock gear that counts as multiple types, letting you choose which path you'd like to take depending on the race, and I actually kinda like this. It builds upon the alternate route ideas from Sonic R, while avoiding the problem of making one route the default fastest. Most of these end up taking about the same amount of time, you just do so in a different way. Despite not loving the gameplay, I found some of the guest franchise elements really fun. There are some general SEGA reps as racers, II from Monkey Ball, Knights, and Ooh La La from Space Channel 5. There are also 2 sick SEGA-themed tracks, where you race on segments themed after a different game, like on a tilting Monkey Ball map or literally jumping into the Crazy Taxi. The crossover aspect is so fun, and it's something they're gonna lean into a lot in just a few years. Apparently a Game Boy Advance version was also in the works, but that ended up being scrapped, possibly because a more powerful hardware was on the horizon. Speaking of which, later the same year Sonic Riders was released, another Sonic racing game came out, Sonic Rivals for the PSP. Both Riders and Rivals were released to commemorate Sonic's 15th anniversary, and while Riders was a racing game from the jump, Sonic Rivals actually started out as a platformer before shifting focus over to a racing game. However, they kept the platformer style of gameplay they had originally built rather than starting from scratch. As a result, you end up playing this weird fusion where it feels like the classic Genesis Sonic games in gameplay, but you're racing against other characters at the same time as well. I actually think this is a really neat idea. It's a little funky, but building upon the classic gameplay is really creative. It's also pretty cool to see some characters in this 2D platformer context where we rarely, if ever, have seen them. And in concept, this should work really well, but getting the actual game in my hands, it's just alright. The controls are fairly clunky, and I just don't feel like I'm going very fast. That's a flop on 2 accounts, not going fast in a racing game and not going fast in a Sonic game. Maybe it's because it was made for a PSP with a small screen, but it just doesn't ever feel that exciting. And then there's another downside to the screen size. There are obstacles, hazards, and if you're going at your very slow top speed, you just don't really have that much time to react. Then there are the boost objects, where you pause for a second and can press either X to jump up or circle to boost forward, but again, you don't have very much time to notice these objects, decide on an input, and then press it, so you end up just doing neither of those and you take a loss on your speed as a result. It's like those sections in the classic Sonic games where you're speeding down the track, but then a spring sends you backwards or you run into a set of spikes. But now, put that in a racing game, you can never see it coming, and the AI is also perfect and knows where to go and what to avoid. It's probably a decent balance mechanic when you race against another human, but who's busting out their PSPs in 2024 to run some Sonic Rival sets? The items in this game are weird. I could be wrong, but it felt like any item I used could basically hit the opponent no matter how far ahead they are, which makes it feel like there is no advantage to being in the lead until the last stretch of the track. If I can just get hit with a fireball or ice blast from literally anywhere, why bother if I can just stay behind and do that to them? Each character can also pick up an item to activate their signature move. Sonic gets a huge burst of speed, Shadow gets chaos control, the usual kind of things. But Silver's is bullshit. He activates ESP, which randomizes your controls no matter how far away you are from him. So basically, if he's a mile ahead of you, your controls still get mixed up, and Silver can just increase his lead even more. It's insane. The game also has this weird card collection aspect, where you earn them as rewards through gameplay, and then use them to customize your racer. Naturally, a big emphasis is on cosmetics, but you can also change up your character's stats for multiplayer as well. The cards vaguely play a role in the story mode as well. It turns out Eggman has this magical camera that can turn anything into a card, like he's some Yu-Gi-Oh villain or something. Then it turns out it's actually a descendant of Eggman's disguised as Eggman who wants to take a picture of the entire Earth and turn it into a card or something. However, what's really weird about the story mode is the way these supposed friends interact with each other. It's supposed to be the rivals part of Sonic Rivals, but characters just show up and beef with each other on sight, and in some cases it kinda just feels out of character. You end up racing characters for most of the story, however you will also regularly have these weird boss fights where you have to defeat the boss before your rival, which boils down to performing a homing attack on the rival over and over until the boss's weak point reveals itself. Really fun stuff. To promote the game, the Sonic Rivals website also had a flash game, which is technically a racing game. In one-player mode, it's just a time trial, but there's also a two-player mode where each player controls part of the keyboard and races against each other. I mean, what do you want me to say? It's a flash game, and it's from 2006. It's about as good or as bad as the vast majority of flash games from that time. And then, literally the year after Sonic Rivals, they made a sequel. Sonic Rivals 2 is almost exactly like Sonic Rivals 1, but with some minor changes to gameplay. I also had an even harder time with the boost objects. I don't know if they made the timing less generous, but it sure does seem like it because I was failing these things all the time. And there are even more characters. Surprisingly, there were only 5 characters in the first game. In Rivals 2, we get a whopping, 3 more. But they did also throw in a new mode, Battle. Rather than give you a track or a boss to fight around you, you literally just fight each other. They have other modes like Capture the Chow and King of the Hill, which is pretty neat. It at least somewhat justifies a whole new sequel, because frankly, this is just the same game. Scratch that. Sonic Rivals 2 has voice acting, and some of the best one-take voice acting that you've ever heard.
Hey, look! It's Knuckles and Rouge! Well, look who it is, Knuckles and Rouge.
This pair of games just feels so bland. I like the idea of turning the classic Sonic gameplay into a racing context. I just didn't really care for the games that they ultimately made. Shortly after Sonic Rivals 2, another console racing game dropped. Sonic Riders Zero Gravity released for both the Wii and PlayStation 2. The Wii version naturally had motion controls, and I tried those out for all of 10 seconds before I just gave up and settled on using the GameCube controller. The story for this game is wild. A magical bracelet falls into Midgar from Final Fantasy VII and grants Sonic anti-gravity powers, and then suddenly the robot cops are after him. The Babylon Rogues are back, and these magic bracelets are actually used to summon the Babylon Garden, a floating city. Then Eggman summons a black hole inside of this city. And then it turns out that the ancient Babylonians were actually aliens the entire time. The air system from the first Riders game has thankfully been totally replaced with a brand new gravity system. Throughout a race, you'll earn gravity points through things like item boxes, doing tricks, or grinding. Then you can spend this gravity in 2 different ways. The first is gravity control, which allows you to shift gravity and pivot into a totally different direction. This can be used to access alternate routes, which is a neat way to include alternate pathing while still using the new system. Its other purpose is a replacement for drifting, being able to pause and turn on a dime to make a sharp turn. This is way worse than just plain drifting. I mean, in this series, they are 0 for 2 on drifting mechanics. It's far too difficult to aim down the straightaway, and you feel the pressure when your meter is actually going down. Again, it feels like they're actively punishing you for drifting, and that's just a core mechanic of racing games at this point, so it's kind of counterintuitive. The other use for gravity is Gravity Dive, which is best used on long straightaways. This will blast you forward at high speeds as long as you have gravity in the meter, and you can run into and bounce off other objects to add to your meter, prolonging how long this boost can last. Another mechanic in the game is gear parts. During the race, you'll collect rings, and you can spend those rings to activate one of your board's gear parts. These give you a whole bunch of upgrades or passives, like a bigger gauge, improved endurance, or increased stats. It can also transform your gear. There's a grind upgrade, one that turns it into an air ride, allowing you to take air paths, and a bike that blasts through obstacles. There's even one that effectively lets you drift normally, which hurts especially. While these are kinda the same as the board-specific categories in the previous game, I kinda like that it's something you need to activate in a race. By the time you have enough rings to transform your board, you're probably at the end of the second lap or starting the third lap, so these alternate routes feel like they open up at the end of a race, making it more engaging to switch up your path. Rather than the course changing on the final lap, or those paths being there every time, you're simply capable of accessing these routes that were always there. Once again, there are more fun SEGA racers and tracks, themed around both the 1980s and 1990s SEGA games, which is really fun. Overall, I kinda like this game. It's definitely an improvement on the first Riders, which I didn't exactly care for, but this one feels like they tightened up the gameplay and got rid of the ability to not be able to race, which is nice. Also, for some reason, Jet loves to call Sonic by his full government name.
Sonic the Hedgehog! Sonic the Hedgehog! Sonic the Hedgehog! Sonic the Hedgehog!
But after a decade of fighting it, SEGA finally relented, and we got Now this is what I'm talking about. Sonic characters and SEGA All-Stars in a huge crossover racing game that actually takes place in cars. No skateboards, no feet, we're finally just in plain old race cars the way God intended. And the best part is, it plays so good. Of all the different Mario Kart clones I've played over the years, this is actually one of the best feeling ones. It really is up there with Mario Kart in just hitting the mark in nearly every category. The roster is also incredibly strong. Obviously, Sonic characters take the forefront, which is fine, but they've included a ton of characters from other SEGA series as well. And because the game dropped on multiple consoles, there are also some exclusive characters. On the Wii version, you can play as your Mii, which is neat. Mario was apparently planned to appear as a guest character as well, but with Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games being fairly new, I guess they didn't want to oversaturate that crossover. Over on the Xbox, you could play as your Xbox avatar, but a full exclusive character was also on Xbox, Banjo and Kazooie from Nuts and Bolts. Okay, so despite their design being super whack, this collab is actually pretty cool. The newest Banjo game was all about vehicle creation, so including them in a racing game was actually a really clever crossover. Their vehicle was even provided by Rare, which came from a scrapped Banjo-Kazooie racing game, which was a sort of precursor to Nuts and Bolts. This collab was so notable that the duo received top billing, being officially in the game's title and on the box for the Xbox version. There are also the classic kart racer items like you'd expect, substitutes for green shells, red shells, bananas, items like that. But each racer also has their own signature item, which allows them to activate their All-Star move. Each has a different theme based on the character and slightly different effects, but generally these items tend to launch you forward faster while also hitting enemies in the way. But they're so cool being themed around each individual character. It reminds me of those special character items from Double Dash, but cranked up to 11. All of the tracks in the game are really solid as well, representing a wide range of themes and also referencing SEGA's rich library. The exception, I think, is the Jet Set Radio tracks, where they kinda just feel like city. It would have been nice to see a little more of the graffiti and popping color flair that Jet Set Radio has, but other than that, the tracks are super solid. The frame rate on the console version, though, is also pretty rough at certain points. Playing the PC version pretty much solves that problem, especially with modern hardware, but at the cost of having 0 exclusive characters. My favorite country, SEGA. Shockingly, the home consoles weren't the only versions of the game. They miraculously put this game on the Nintendo DS. And what's more, it's actually kinda good. This didn't feel like a quick and dirty port. Everything is a remade, lower poly version of the racers, karts, tracks, everything. Some minor things needed to be adjusted, like the way certain items work, but ultimately, this is the console game in miniature. And truthfully, I think it might be a little too much like the console game, at least in controls. It's very obvious these tracks and controls were designed for the home consoles, and it doesn't mesh fully with the Nintendo DS. Compare that to a game like Mario Kart DS, where the controls are tight and the courses were clearly designed around what the DS controls could handle, and I think Sonic and SEGA All-Stars just lacks a little bit. But that's genuinely my only complaint, and it doesn't take away from my experience with this version of the game. Honestly, it's just surprising they got it on here. What isn't surprising is that they put this game also on iOS and Android. SEGA was really one of the first out of the gate to put their games on mobile, and to this day they're still a pretty big player in the mobile game space. Sadly though, this version of the game has been taken down from the different storefronts, and while I tried to get an archived version up and running, I just couldn't. But from the footage that is out there, it seems like it's the same as the DS version, but with fewer characters and tracks, and touch and motion controls. I was, however, able to get another version of the game working, a Java version for teeny tiny cell phones. When you compare this version to the previous Java games found on phones, you can really tell that the technology made crazy leaps and bounds. Unlike all the other versions, this is a completely different version of the game, but it's fairly impressive what they were able to accomplish. There are other racers, boost and drift mechanics, and item boxes, all on a device that can hold exactly 3 MP3s. It's definitely in the lower tier of mobile game, where it's just something to mess around with in tiny bursts rather than something to be heavily invested in, but it's neat nonetheless. And the sprites are beautiful. I am such a sucker for good sprite work, and these really are just top notch. And I don't have an interesting transition, so... oh no. Sonic Free Riders was the third and final entry in the Riders series, developed for the Xbox 360 Kinect, so the game was entirely controlled through gestures you would do with your entire body in front of the camera peripheral. I don't have a ton of experience with Kinect games. In fact, outside of those demos that you might have seen in like a Walmart, I think this might have been my genuine first Kinect game. So I jumped into the tutorial and tried to learn the different gestures that it wanted from me, until I got to this part where you need to perform a spin. I, for the life of me, could not get this to work. I tried so many times, and Sonic would almost begin the move, then like bug out and decide not to do it. I'm not joking when I say I literally could not get past this part of the tutorial. I played zero of the actual story because the game would not function. It's possible I was just losing my patience after playing a dozen or so Sonic racing games, but this one was just bad. Evidently, there's a mod that allows you to play the game with just a controller, and that sounds far more tolerable, but I will not be booting this game up again anytime soon. Now it's time for Peak. Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed is the sequel to the first game with way too many words in its title, and this is just a genuinely really good game. It takes everything good about the first one and just improves it. The big gimmick of this entry is that the vehicles have the ability to transform into boats and planes. This is something that kart racers love to do, starting all the way back with the success of Diddy Kong Racing. However, most kart racers that do this just put in the transformation without any real use for it. Sure, we might be boating or flying now, but the track is still literally just one path I'm required to follow. It's no different than using the karts. But that's not really the case with Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed. When a section makes you transform, I feel like the track actually complements the different mechanics of the vehicle, and this is especially emphasized by actual track changes. Like, let's take a look at the Skies of Arcadia course, Rogue's Landing. It starts out as a standard race, but then in the second lap, cannonballs are being launched onto the track and destroying parts of it. By the third lap, the entire raceway is destroyed, and you complete the race up in the skies in this wide open area. That's such a cool idea for a track, and giving this little narrative explanation for the form change works so well. They really went all in on the character roster too. You know how people talk about Super Smash Kart, where Nintendo should just add all of their IPs into one kart racer? Well, that is literally this, but for SEGA. You've got a ton of guys returning from the first game, and brand new characters from so many different games. There's even this sick throwback character, which uses the Hornet from Daytona USA for the car, an F-14 from Afterburner, and a whole ass Dreamcast controller as the boat. And then just for good measure, throw Wreck-It Ralph in there. As part of a deal with Disney to let Sonic and Eggman appear in the Wreck-It Ralph movie, Ralph himself appears as a racer in this game, which is so bizarre. But not as bizarre as a real-life race car driver, Danica Patrick, also being in the game, in an almost unbelievable collaboration between her, Hot Wheels, and GoDaddy. And then you've got several Steam-exclusive characters, including 3 characters in one from Team Fortress 2. Overall, I think this is the best Sonic racing game that SEGA has ever made. It's just a genuinely fun and good game, and if they continued building upon this formula in a similar manner that Mario Kart does, I could see it being incredibly successful, so let's hope they keep doing that, huh? This game also dropped on the PlayStation Vita, and it runs. In contrast to the Nintendo DS version, this is indeed just an incredibly quick and dirty port. It seemed like they saw the PS Vita was stronger than previous handhelds, so they went ahead and tried. The frame rate is bad, the game just overall looks incredibly unpolished, and it just feels awful to play. And that goes double for the 3DS version. I don't know who was insane enough to take a console as underpowered as the 3DS and try to port essentially an entire console game on it. They were so focused on whether they could that they didn't stop and think if they should. Also, for some reason, the minimap on the bottom just gets bored and goes off to do something else. This game was also on iOS and Android, and like its predecessor, is no longer available on the storefronts, which is a shame because I would have liked to see how poorly it compared to the Vita and 3DS versions. Since there are technically 2 versions of Sonic games that I wasn't able to play, let me see if I can make it up to you. I never said it would be good. Like I said before, SEGA has been all in on mobile games, and one of their more interesting ventures has been putting Sonic in the auto-runner genre. Games like Temple Run and Subway Surfers exploded with popularity in the early 2010s. And big game studios really jumped on this genre as well. They have a regular Sonic one called Sonic Dash, and a sequel based on Sonic Boom. But then they took that auto runner game, and they turned it into a racing game called Sonic Forces Speed Battle, Sonic Forces PvP Battle Race, Sonic Forces Run Battle Game. I have no idea what this game is actually called. And at any rate, there isn't very much to say about it. It's an auto runner where you try to mess up the least. It's an interesting formula, I guess, but it's such a mobile game with so many microtransactions and watch an ad to get double rewards, so I'm gonna speed PvP run battle game away from this one. 2019 saw the release of a new racing game, Team Sonic Racing. This game removes the All-Stars and only keeps the Sonic characters, and in my opinion, this is a complete step backwards. Half the fun of the last two games was the crossover aspect and having racers, items, characters, all from different game series. The developers of this one intentionally wanted to focus on the Sonic series and take advantage of its full suite of characters and elements. And that would be fine, except they just didn't do that. When I hear taking advantage of the full Sonic universe, I'm thinking we're gonna see obscure characters like Fang the Hunter or Bean the Dynamite. Instead, we have exactly who you would expect, which makes for a pretty lackluster roster. Honestly, the only interesting character is the 4-in-1 Chow Racer. The whole game just feels super generic. The tracks are all Sonic themed, and they're fine, but they're nothing all too spectacular either, especially when we've seen a handful of them before. On top of that, all of the items in the game are just wisps, which is so boring to me. Sure, it gives like an in-universe reason for these items to work like they do, but I'm not looking for canonical consistency in a kart racing game. The controls are top-notch, but that's because they're carried over from All-Stars Transformed. They also got rid of flight and boat sections, which is sort of a disappointment, but I also can be satisfied with only kart racing if it's a fun enough time. I will say the game does innovate in some pretty interesting ways. The whole focus is on teams, with 3 racers working together. You can give benefits to your teammates on the racetrack, like giving them an extra speed boost by driving near them or using the slingshot maneuver. The most interesting is the item transfer, where you can request or offer up an item and another teammate can toss theirs to you. There's also an ultimate meter, which replaces all-star moves. All 3 teammates work to fill the meter, and when activated, all 3 teammates get the bonus. And it's sadly just a generic speed up, flashing white type of thing. I respect them for going for some different mechanics in team battles, and honestly, they're pretty neat. It's just not enough to get me all that invested in the game. Like I said, this feels like just a step back. It seems like they could have just continued with the Sonic and All-Stars formula, and while they kept the gameplay in many ways, it's just kind of worse. And they didn't even really take that much advantage of the Sonic universe. But actually, it has gambling, so all is forgiven. But you know, I just kinda wish I had this game on my phone. As part of SEGA's partnership with Apple, they put a form of this game on Apple Arcade. It's kinda weird because it's like a promotion for Team Sonic Racing, but it also kind of replaces that game in a way too. The gameplay is quite literally just Team Sonic Racing, but on mobile. There's team synergies, unlockable characters, and customizable vehicles. There are some slight differences in things like unlockables, but this is pretty much the same game. I'm kind of curious why they dropped the team for this one and just called it Sonic Racing. I get it's probably to make them legally distinct, but the games are so close already that I honestly think they could have just straight up said, this is the mobile version of Team Sonic Racing. I don't know, it's kind of weird. There are a couple of weird Sonic games where they could be considered racing games if you wanted to be pedantic. Sonic Racing Shift Up is technically a racing game, but the whole point is to shift gears as fast as possible in order to defeat Shadow. You're not controlling the kart or interacting with other racers, it's just a gear shift simulator TM. Oh, and this one is also lost media. Sonic Rumble is another game that's kinda hard to place. Certainly it's a race against other players, but it's also not exactly what you think of when you think of racing games. It's a battle royale, obstacle course, race, so it's kind of 3 things in one. But also, I doubt it will have Among Us, so what's even the point? And this isn't even considering the fan efforts. An open source fan game called Sonic Roboblast 2 set out to create classic Sonic levels in 3D, but they also created a side mode that recreated the Sonic Riders gameplay. And then that side mode received a Mario Kart inspired mode. And then that ended up being its own whole game called Sonic Roboblast 2 Kart. So that's a spin-off fan game based on a mode of a mode in a fan game that was all incidentally built on the source code of Doom. That's a wild family tree. And with that, we have played every single Sonic racing game. And with that, we have played almost every single Sonic racing game. Obviously, I can't talk about that game yet, but with a title like Crossworlds, I really hope that we're going back to the crossover aspect that worked so well before. For so many of the racing games that SEGA made, it just felt like they were trying to capture the Mario Kart audience without copying Mario Kart. And I think that's respectable to a degree. They didn't want to just copy the formula, they wanted to put their own spin on it. But at a certain point, I just think you have to cut your losses and go ahead and copy what you know is a winner. No one is going to beat Mario Kart, and honestly, that's okay. There can be other kart racers that coexist in a world where Mario Kart is top dog. But I had to play a lot of crap to get to where I am today, and so now, I have to take my revenge.